Hey guys, welcome back. So now we are getting into Heroes Reborn Part 4, which in this case it heavily deals with Dr. Spectrum, the solo Green Lantern of Marvel's Justice League, who has built quite the reputation throughout the galaxy. And oh yeah, there's a cameo from Thanos as well, but we'll talk about that. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so as far as this new version of the Marvel Universe that we're dealing with here, I've talked about some of what's been the build up to this point with how we initially got the Squadron Supreme of America prior to Heroes Reborn, and how much of these stories have reflected that, and I put most of that in the first video, but in issue 4, we finally get the reveal that it was blank all along, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Just in case somebody accidentally stumbled across this video and they just wanted to be surprised. But kicking things off for this one, we start off at the blue area of the moon, to where at this point you have a number of groups that have come together, like your Skrulls and Kree Empyre, and come to think of it, it just looks like Empyre never happened here. Lucky for them. But here on the blue area of the moon, where there's also no mention of Inhumans, because they've been out of the picture for a while, but it's here where over a dozen representatives from across different galaxies, they've all come together to hire the greatest bounty hunter across the cosmos, and it's Raccoon. But in this universe, Groot is a gun, and though I don't think that's been the case like all along throughout this reality, like at some point Groot was turned into a gun, but here and now he's a tree gun. Him and Rocket are bounty hunters, and they're the best at what they do. And I know like it sounds pretty weak like just saying it, but in a little bit we're going to talk about some of the things that Groot can do, and it's pretty insane. But when they arrive here at this meeting, all we really know at this point is that the person that they're hunting is from Earth, and Rocket, he's ready to bag this dude and come back and get the money. But with saying this, Groot, he wants to know more about this bounty and why so many people across the galaxy want him. Because the stories they've heard prior to now, they just can't all be true. But it's after this when we then jump over to the Watcher, who had just left this meeting. And it's here where we follow him to where we find out who this bounty actually is. Because when the Watcher left, he already knew all the stories which the different groups were telling Rocket, because at one point he had just stood by and watched many of these things happen. But then at one point he stepped in, though it went against his sworn duty, just to only watch, and that's when Dr. Spectrum took both of his eyes, because Dr. Spectrum is the great threat that needs to be stopped, and he is the bounty that Rocket and Groot are being sent to kill. And though we don't get like all the examples of what Dr. Spectrum has done, we do get a few examples, like him taking the Watcher's eyes and a couple more. But even without it going into depth, like from galaxy to galaxy, and showing us every little thing that Dr. Spectrum did, but like very early on we kind of get the message, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But with us jumping over to Dr. Spectrum here, Colonel Joseph Ledger, it's here where we see his entire battle with Thanos take place on one page. And at first when I saw this, I was like, come on man, really? But then I thought about it and I'm thinking like, okay, this kind of falls in line with like all the Hyperion battles that we'd seen up to this point, to where as soon as they start, they're finished. And the only time we see a fight or confrontation actually stretched out, it's with someone who's either an Avenger or someone who's supposed to be a hero in the main Marvel universe. But in the case of Thanos getting the Infinity Rings, this wasn't his first time getting them. And so this time Dr. Spectrum confronted him and he just blasted his fingers off. The end. But then after doing this, Dr. Spectrum then took Thanos to nowhere, which in this reality is just a huge prison, which was created by Dr. Spectrum after ripping the head off a Celestial. And man, I know if Knull were alive, like if Knull was alive and he had seen this, he'd have been heated, because Knull is the soldier boy of decapitating Celestials. But with Dr. Spectrum doing this, like here's what I'm talking about. Because he tore the head off the Celestial, turned it into a black site prison, and he did this just to show as an example that there's only one God out there and he's American. Which are two things I want you guys to pay attention to, because those are the things that the Squadron Supreme of America put emphasis on the most, which are their God and their country. And as we see this unfold, and more so with Dr. Spectrum, with the choices made of taking the Watcher's eyes and building this black site prison, which is cosmic powered because it is the head of a Celestial. And that's also another takeaway from Knull, much like we talked about after we covered like what happened to the Sentry after he died, because in that same video we talked about how the Necro Sword got its power and also lost its power. But here's the thing about Dr. Spectrum and what he's doing across the different galaxies, with him using extreme force and doing who knows what to all these different empires, as well as him also throwing some in the negative zone. But all of these moves that he's making throughout the universe, he's imposing the will of his God in his country. But for Dr. Spectrum, as soon as he drops off Thanos and leaves nowhere, he's then immediately attacked by Rocket and Groot, who are likely just on a stakeout like right outside of nowhere, just waiting for Dr. Spectrum to either be going in or coming out. But whatever they did, it worked and they caught him on his way out. But for Dr. Spectrum, meeting Rocket Raccoon for the first time, like he's heard of his reputation as the deadliest bounty hunter in the galaxy. And from just looking at Rocket, like he finds it hard to believe. But then when he brings out Groot, the tree gun, which once again doesn't sound like much, but when Groot lets off and all these little mini I Am Groots just start latching to Dr. Spectrum, he immediately gets humbled like real quick, because when these I Am Groot bullets start latching on to Dr. Spectrum, they start to grow on him and cover his whole body. And when this happens, it looks crazy painful. And Dr. Spectrum is trying to ask his prism like, how does he fight these things? How does he stop them? But this whole process has him separated from his prism, which is also the source of his power. And he tries to tear his way out of these vines to get back to it, but Rocket then just hits him with a maggot gun. Because by the request from everyone from the blue side of the moon, who are gonna pay Rocket for bringing this guy back in pieces, like part of their request for this bounty was that he makes sure that Dr. Spectrum suffers. So that's kind of what we got going on here. But of course, with this Rocket Raccoon being Rocket Raccoon, he sees the prism as something he can take and pawn to Old Man Quill, who I would like to just see in this reality. But before Rocket can snatch the prism, it returns back to Joseph Ledger and it restores back to him his power. When this happens, like Joseph admits that he doesn't know how this prism works exactly, and he also expresses that this prism was a gift from quote unquote God Almighty, so that he could be an instrument among the Forsaken Stars. But as soon as he gets the prism back, Groot is trying to charge at him and he just turns around and blasts Groot. And when he does this, Dr. Spectrum tells Rocket and what's left of Groot that he himself is the reason that there's no more Kree accusers, there's no more Black Novas or Starjammer space pirates, because he's the reason that someday space will be safe for decent God-fearing American settlers, which very much sounds like it lines up with his God and his country. But at this point, with Rocket pretty much figuring that he's lost this fight, he orders for his ship to fire all the antimatter mines and negabombs on his location. And after firing on his location, he wants the ship to get out of there as fast as possible, at double light speed to protect the passenger who's on it. And as soon as he does this, his hands start glowing, and right away he's like, what is she doing? Because he didn't want the girl on his ship to send him her power, but she does it anyway, and all of a sudden Rocket Raccoon is Starbrand. And from that alone, it kind of tells you who's on the ship, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit, along with some flashback stuff as well. But for Rocket Raccoon, when he gets the Starbrand, he immediately flips back into fight mode, taking the heat directly back to Dr. Spectrum. But then also it's here where we get a bit of flashback for Dr. Spectrum, to where at one point he was interrogating Ego the Living Planet, because prior to this, Dr. Spectrum had found carbon trails from secret space flights that were leaving Earth, and Dr. Spectrum took offense because they weren't American. But because of that, he pressed Ego to find out where these ships had came from, and for Ego, who has eyes the size of moons, he told Dr. Spectrum that they came from Wakanda. But with hearing this, like, he didn't believe Ego, because in this reality, Wakanda is still a secret, and for that reason, Dr. Spectrum had believed that Ego had been lying the whole time. But then jump back to now, when he sees Rocket with the Starbrand, he immediately knows that the Starbrand shouldn't be here in this reality, because he had already confronted someone else who was from some other new reality, and with confronting them, Dr. Spectrum had already thrown them and the Starbrand in the negative zone, so for that reason it shouldn't be here. But with this matchup that pretty much turns into Battle of the Constructs, and like on one hand you have Dr. Spectrum, who then puts together a whole row of tanks and just blasts them at Rocket, while on the other hand you have Rocket, who not only was best friends with the gun, but he's a pretty dang good engineer at that. And so in return, he builds a bigger gun that shoots stars. And when this happens, Rocket is just like, okay, you're done. And Dr. Spectrum on the other hand, he's like, you know what? God help me, I'm starting to like this guy. But when he shoots this star at Dr. Spectrum, he just cuts it in half. And it's nuts. Like, I mean, this dude even fighting the Starbrand, like, it's beyond me. But that's not even the kicker, because he then tells Rocket that he's been places and seen things that Rocket couldn't even imagine. And when saying this, he tells Rocket that he has absorbed the Cancerverse into his prism. And with saying this, he means like the actual Cancerverse, like Earth 10011, and not like an alternate version, but like the actual thing. with the many angled ones and like the eternal living version of death, and he just releases a portion of this necro system on Rocket, who is instantly just consumed by its corruption. But even still, Dr. Spectrum just doesn't stop there, and he tells Rocket like, since you like stars so much, I got just the thing for you. And then he takes Rocket and smashes him headfirst into a supernova, and when he does this, it effectively kills Rocket. But as Rocket dies, Dr. Spectrum, he expected Rocket to give out a little sooner, but before Rocket went out, like, he used every use of colorful profanity, to where some of which Dr. Spectrum hadn't even heard in any quadrant. And yep, that sounds like Rocket. But then after this, we then go right back to his ship, and it's here where we see the girl who he was talking about, who is none other than Brandy Selby, the Starbrand baby. And upon Rocket's death, the Starbrand returned back to her. But then also it's here where we hear the ship initiate protocols that are kicking in right after Rocket's death, and it's here where we hear his message for Brandy, which are for her to stay safe and stay hidden until one day where she'll save the whole galaxy, and when that day comes, she'll know. But then after this, we go back to Earth in Washington, D.C., to where we see this conversation between Dr. Spectrum, Joseph Ledger, and President Phil Coulson. And at this point, Colonel Ledger, he's filling in President Coulson, letting him know that the Starbrand got away, but also that he figured out that the Watcher and the other intergalactic representatives had placed a bounty on him, and he lets the President know that he's going to take care of them soon. And when he tells him this, President Coulson looks at him and is like, hey, you look like you have more that you want to say. Like, just know that we're in the house of the Lord. You can speak freely here. And it's here where Colonel Ledger tells him that he had a recent meeting with the Squadron Supreme of America, and in that meeting, the Blur had mentioned what he'd seen in the Dread Dimension, which, much like we'd seen in issue 3, the Blur noticed that the fabric of reality had been tampered with. But Colonel Ledger tells President Coulson that he just figured all that was nonsense, because as Dr. Spectrum, he's seen the entire cosmic tapestry. So if anything had been tampered with, then he would know. And as soon as he says this, the offering plate goes by, and we see a $10 bill that says, "In Mephisto, we trust." And it shows us right away that when it comes to God and country for the Squadron Supreme of America, that Mephisto is their god. And I mean, it really isn't so much of a reveal at this point, but it's still nice to see it confirmed. Though there are still many questions of how exactly Mephisto pulled this off. And that explanation back in the main universe, it probably started when he reclaimed his throne as the King of Hell within Ghost Rider King in Black, but even still, there are many questions yet to be answered about how this whole thing with Phil Coulson and the Squadron Supreme of America went from semi-local to the entire Marvel Universe. But then after this, going into the epilogue, it's here where we have the flashback for like your history of Brandy Selby and how many years ago she had came across Rocket and Groot in this universe. Because when they found her, she was just floating in space and Groot snatched her up to take her in, while Rocket was a bit more hesitant because he initially thought this was just the Skrull in disguise that was gonna kill them both as soon as she got on board. But with them taking her in and pretty much raising her, we then fast forward to today after Rocket's death, and it's here where she tells Groot, who's grown back at this point, likely from one of the plants that were still on the ship, but it's here where she just spazzes out, telling Groot that she wants to go back to Earth. And Groot tells her like to stay hidden, to stay safe, in pretty much the same speech that Rocket had given, but for Groot of course it only comes out as "I am Groot." But at this point, Brandy doesn't want to hide anymore, and she tells Groot like that's what Rocket would say, but he's dead now. And at this point, she tells Groot that she's old enough to know that something is wrong with the universe and the Starbrand can fix it. And with saying this, she demands that Groot takes her to Earth, because if he doesn't, she'll go on her own, and when she gets there, she's going for Dr. Spectrum. But as soon as Brandy says this, they're then approached by a ship, to where they're then hailed by Captain Okoye of the Star Panther McCandle. And when we see this, like, this is clearly the secret ship which Ego was talking about when he was interrogated by Dr. Spectrum. But then also it's pretty interesting, like the McCandle, I think that was the same name of the ship that we'd seen the Wakandans aboard within the intergalactic Empire of Wakanda. But this time clearly something else is going on, because it looks like the Blackbird from the X-Men animated series intro. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support. And for anyone who's new here, who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.